Swifters, we're going to talk about the ViewController lifecycle in this video, and specifically, we're going to present some circumstances that often trip up new developers. And while you'll find Apple's documentation mentions the ViewController lifecycle, it's not very good at helping understand the quirks and nuances that we'll demonstrate in this video. And I've seen this trip up a bunch of students, so hopefully we'll save you lots of time and frustration by going through this. Now, we'll specifically demonstrate how the lifecycle differs when returning from ViewControllers presented via a show segue versus returning from a ViewController that was presented modally, and we'll show how UIPageViewController can preload ViewControllers and how this impacts any code that you might place in ViewDidLoad or some of the other lifecycle methods. Now we'll also talk about the how, why, and when of overriding class methods and using super to call the superclasses method. So let's cycle up. So Swifters, since we're going to be printing things out on the console, why don't we first get rid of any extra print statements in our code. We use print statements a lot to confirm the code is working the way we expect, and we shouldn't get rid of any error printing statements, but we can get rid of all the other ones right now. So to get rid of these extra print statements, let's head up to the Find Navigator, that's the magnifying glass, to search for every occurrence of the word print in the project. And I won't get rid of that one that prints out the URL. That's still useful for us. And we want to keep the print messages in there that print errors or warnings. But we have two statements down here that printed out the day, high, and low, and the hourly temperature information. So I'll click and delete both of those. And I can also get rid of this line that I commented out, which was my old call to the file name for icon. I don't need that anymore. And everything else is either an error message or a warning message, so I want to keep those in. These last two are actually from the CocoaPod. And so this looks good. Now the reason I wanted to clear out the clutter is because I'm going to print out a few things in the console to show how the ViewController lifecycle works. When a ViewController loads, displays, and goes away, there are a bunch of events that occur, and we refer to these events as the ViewController lifecycle. And we can catch these events with methods that are part of every ViewController. Now what they test for is pretty self-explanatory. In fact, we've already been using one. ViewDidLoad detects when the view loads, and this one is so common for use for setup code that Xcode actually gives it to you whenever you create a new file that subclasses UIViewController. ViewDidLoad means it's loaded into memory, but it hasn't appeared yet. Now there's also ViewWillAppear, and that will run just before a view appears. ViewDidAppear will run when, you guessed it, after the view is visible, and there's ViewWillDisappear and ViewDidDisappear. We'll ignore the disappear functions for now. Now, even though the methods themselves are self-explanatory, they can behave and fire really differently depending on the app and how the app is set up. Apple's docs don't do a great job of helping the new developer understand this, and I've seen even professional developers waste a lot of time adding these functions, putting print statements inside, trying to figure out what they do and when. So here are a couple of super quick demonstrations that you can refer back to in case you run into questions when you need to know when these functions run in your apps. In an app like our to-do list, which starts with a ViewController with a table view in it and then segues to a detail ViewController and then back, when the app first launches, the first view with the table view launches, the view loads, it will appear, it did appear. Now that's pretty much what you'd expect. Now I put a print statement with 1, 2, and 3 check marks in the ViewDidLoad, ViewWillAppear, and ViewDidAppear, and this is what the console shows. Now each time we segue to the detail ViewController, all three of these methods will fire as well. It's the case whether we're editing a record with a show segue or we're adding a new record with present modally. I put soccer goals in the detail ViewControllers methods. The to-do lists are goals, bad pun, but to illustrate the point, you see that all three, each time we segue to the detail ViewController, execute. Again, pretty much what you'd expect. Coming back, here's where things get a little bit different and developers often struggle. So first, in all cases with this kind of app, the ViewController that you're returning to doesn't load again. It's already been loaded when the app launched, so the ViewDidLoad function in this ViewController with the table view will never execute again after that first time it executes when the app first launches. You may or may not have seen that coming, but here where some of the differences start. When you come back from a show segue, the view will appear and the view did appear. But here's the trickiest one. When you come back from a present modally segue, the ViewController underneath the modal segue, our original ViewController, is considered to already be appearing. It wasn't in the previous case when we came back from a show, but it is considered to already be appearing when we come back from a present modally. So these two functions don't execute when you return to that original ViewController with the table view. Coming back from a show segue, ViewWillAppear and ViewDidAppear fire. Coming back from present modally, neither of these fire. So this weird behavior is worth filing away in your brain's developer memory cabinet, and if you ever notice unexpected behavior around these events in the future, you can come back here, rewatch this video, maybe add all three of these methods to your ViewControllers and add some print statements so that you can tell what's happening and under what conditions. Here's why we're concerned about these events in our WeatherGift app. The behavior of the events when swiping between ViewControllers when using a page ViewController also differs from the previous examples. So this is how it works. The first time your app loads, the first ViewController loads, it will appear, it did appear, what you'd expect. But then here is where it might be unexpected. If you swipe to the right, the ViewController while swiping to will load, it will appear, it did appear. You'd expect that. But the unexpected part, a page ViewController might preload other views. So even though we're looking at this view, another view did load will also execute for a ViewController you're not seeing yet. Why is this an issue? Well, if you are expecting some code to run only when a ViewController appears, if we eventually swipe right to this ViewController, then you might see this view did load execute code earlier than anticipated. Or if we swipe left back to where we came from, then we end up never showing this ViewController that was preloaded. So we might have executed code for a ViewController that we've never seen. Now that can be really important, and we'll pay attention to that in our app, and we'll actually move code from view did load to view will appear. So here I am in WeatherGift in location detail ViewController, and we can see that we've got a view did load in here already. I'm going to add a view will appear and a view did appear. So just below my view did load, I'm going to type in view will appear. You want to make sure that you select that. Look what code completion tells us. It says notifies the ViewController that its view is about to be added to the view hierarchy. For purposes of view will appear and view did appear in the ViewController, this just means that the ViewController's main view is about to appear or did appear. That's just what we want, so I'll press return. And just below this, I'll type view did appear, and notice the description and code completion notifies the ViewController that its view was added to the view hierarchy. Now notice when we added these two functions, Xcode added the word override before the keyword func. Now we haven't been paying too much attention to the word override here. Xcode adds this for us, but we need override when we're modifying an existing method that's part of the parent class. So location detail ViewController is a subclass of UIViewController, and all of these functions with override in front of them are methods of UIViewController. So when we want to do something with an existing method, we override it saying we know that it exists, but we're going to make some changes to it. Now Xcode adds the override keyword, so we don't really need to pay attention to when we need to add that. ViewDidLoad is a UIViewController method, so that's why Xcode added override. And it also added a call to super.viewDidLoad inside of the function. What does that do? Well, super calls the original implementation of this method in the super class. So by writing super.viewDidLoad, we're saying, go do all of the stuff in Apple's original method, then come back here and execute all the new stuff that I'm adding. Cool. Now, when do we know we need super? We mentioned this briefly in an earlier video. Apple's documentation will tell you. Here's the documentation for view will appear. I'll search for the word super in this documentation, and I see right here it says, if you override this method, you must call super at some point in your implementation. You usually do that first. So, unfortunately, Xcode doesn't give us the super call when it's needed. It will add override, but it won't give us super. So you really should check the docs each time you override a method that you've never worked with before. So let's head back to our code, and inside of view will appear, I'll say super dot and then view will appear. Here's another warning for a very common error that folks make. With code completion, it's really easy to press return without making absolutely sure that you've selected the right function, because you can see we have view will appear as well as did appear, did disappear, all in here. I'll press return here. Better to avoid this, after typing super dot, you can copy the name of the function right out of the function definition line and paste it after the dot. Even though I'm inside of the function, I'm calling the function, so I need to pass in one parameter animated that's required by the function. What I can do though is just highlight the word animated here, copy it with Command C, and paste it in down below. So now what do we do with view did appear? Do we need super there? Well, we can return to our browser, search for the Apple doc for view did appear. I'll search for the word super on this page as it mentioned, and sure enough, it gives us the same warning we saw before. If you override this method, you must call super at some point during your implementation. So let's return to Xcode, make sure we do that. That's super.viewDidAppear because I'm inside of viewDidAppear, or you could just highlight viewDidAppear and paste it in down below. I'm also going to copy and paste animated in as the parameter that I'm passing in as part of the super call. Now, just to make sure that we really understand what's going on with override and whether or not we need to use super, if we scroll down, we've been using another override function here too. Prepare for Segue. Prepare for Segue is included as a method for all UIViewControllers. So when we type prepare for Segue, we automatically get override. We haven't been using a call to super to prepare for Segue. Let's check the documentation. In your browser, I'm going to search for Prepare for Segue. Make sure you select the right one because Prepare for Segue doesn't show up first, at least not in the search results I'm showing here. And inside the Apple documentation for Prepare for Segue, we don't see any reference to super, and in fact, the first line in the discussion says, the default implementation of this method does nothing, so that you can override it to pass relevant data into the new ViewController or window controller. So no need for us to call super. We've been calling Prepare for Segue the right way. That's good news. Let's roll back up to our view did load, view will appear, view did appear, and put in some print statements, just so we can see when the events fire that call these functions. So right under the super call in view did load, our first one, I'm going to type in print did load executing for, and I want to know which page I'm executing view did load on. So I'm going to use my location index. Remember, that's the value for the element in our weather locations array. So I'll just say for location index equals string interp with location index inside. So this is a good way for us to find out which view controller is actually being loaded or will appear or did appear. And on the previous slides, I showed you an asterisk in here, so I'll put in one asterisk for the view did load print statement. I'll copy this entire print statement and I'll paste it just below the super statement in view will appear and view did appear. And in the print statement in view will appear, I'll add two asterisks to tell it apart from the other print statements, and I'll say will appear executing. And then down here in view did appear, I'll add three asterisks and say did appear executing. And so let's build and run and then take a look at the console to see if we can get down to the bottom of what's going on inside the view controllers that are attached to our UIPageViewController. So our app loads down here in the console, we can see for location index 0, we do a view did load, a view will appear, a view did appear, and since we call update user interface and that calls get data, that's why we have this API call in between view did load and view will appear. This is what we would expect. Let's swipe right, and we see did load, will appear, did appear, all for location index 1. Nothing unexpected here. Let's swipe right again. If you get this warning only once UI table view thing in here, just ignore it. This is a problem Apple's got to address. But if we look at what happened when we swiped a third time, location index 2 did load, will appear, and did appear, but look at this down here. We also did a view did load on location index 3, even though we're not showing it. See down here in the page control which one is black? That's the one that's currently displaying. So on mine, it's Boston College's weather. 0, 1, 2 is black, but I've also loaded the one after that, which is location index 3, which isn't displaying. So we've loaded a view controller that we're not showing. And if we swipe to the left now, we end up never showing that view controller at location index 3. We've loaded something that we're not using. So if you executed some code inside of view did load, that code will execute for a view controller that you never show. Now, there could be circumstances where you do want to execute code before it's displayed, but there are also times when you don't want the code to execute if you haven't shown that view controller. For example, if you're incrementing a count, if you're being charged for usage, there are lots of different scenarios. So feel free to experiment with these things in the simulator if you'd like. You might notice certain behaviors. For example, these events all fire if you partially swipe to the next item, but then let the page view controller snap back to the current view. And so now that we know how this works, we're going to move our code from view did load into view will appear. And that's because when we execute our code to find the device's location, how to do that in the next video, we don't want to call this more time than needed. That's because Apple actually gives us a service for free, but it will penalize you if you make too many calls to what's called the reverse geocoding service. We also don't want to update any of the information in our weather location array if we don't need to, so let's make those changes. Highlight and delete view did appear, and I don't need to do any changes there. In fact, I don't want to update my interface after the view did appear, otherwise any of the changes will be visible as they occur, and that looks like user interface objects are flashing with different values in them. So there's some advantage in doing your interface updating before the view appears in view will appear. But to avoid any of this code executing in the preload and potentially executing when I'm not going to show a view, I'll highlight the text in view did load, I'll cut it out with a Command X, I'll also delete the print statements that I don't need in these two functions, and then I'll paste the code down here in view will appear. And now I ensure that the only time I'm going to update my user interface and execute anything else in this code is just before the view is guaranteed to appear, the view will appear. So we can build and run. We won't notice anything different in our code at all, but our code is more efficient and it won't execute any extra calls that we're not using. So now that we know how to do this, in the next video, we're going to learn how to get the device's location. Keep at it.